Psalm 126. That's where we'll be this afternoon. In the summer of 2018, I moved down to Columbus, Georgia to spend the summer with my now wife's family. We knew she was going to be moving up to Ohio, so we just figured that we would allow her to spend that last few months of single life with her family, and I could get to know them better, live in the same city. And while I was down there, I lived with a family friend, and I worked with her two uncles. And what they did was they would go and they would buy foreclosed on houses, or houses that had been on the market for a long time and were significantly less expensive, and they would flip them. So they would do all the work on the inside, all the work on the outside. And the thing I remember the most about that summer was just how desperately hot it was all the time. It was regularly 100-degree weather. We're working outside in the sun or inside in no air conditioning. And it's not Ohio 100 degrees. It's 100% humidity, 100 degrees. It's Georgia heat. It's hot. So I would go home after the day, take a really cold shower, and I would go over to Carolyn's home, and we would eat dinner and sit down and just talk about our days. And when I would sit down, I would start to get that energy back, and I would start to feel restored to go into the next day. And this restoration, I would feel, well, it doesn't live up to the restoration that the Lord gives us. It was a slim sliver of what that restoration could be like. So today, in Psalm 126, that restoration is what the psalmist is exhorting us towards. And the main idea of Psalm 126 is that we as people of God should be full of the joy of the restoration that the Lord has provided and will provide again. Psalm 126 is the 7th psalm of the 5th book, which is the Song of Ascents. And it's one of 4, Psalm 120, 123, 126, and 130, that are psalms of community or individual laments. So it's psalms of grief or mourning. And what we're learning in Psalm 126 is that this is a community that is desperate for the Lord to provide for them. They're seeking His provision just as we are now. So we're going to go ahead and read Psalm 126. And it says, "When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter and our tongue with shouts of joy. And they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them." The Lord has done great things for us. We are glad. "Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like the streams in the Negeb. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him." Lord, I just thank you for your text. I thank you for the opportunity that you've given me to dwell on it over this last week and to think through it and the conviction that it's brought to me. And I just pray that you let your message shine through it this afternoon. So when we read the first verse of Psalm 126, it says, "When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream." And I think that there's potential for that to cause a bit of confusion or questions to rise up in our mind. What is Zion? Why are we referring to Zion? Who are those who dream? So I think it's important for us to discover some of that. And what is happening in this psalm is that the people of Israel are looking back on the Lord delivering them and rescuing them from the Babylonian exile. So we're just going to establish the what and the where of Zion. Zion, in a physical sense, is a hill that's right on the outside of the walls of Jerusalem. And the closeness in area is sometimes why the nation of Israel as a whole is referred to as Mount Zion. But I think more so what this is looking at is a more of a spiritual and a symbolic version of Zion. And so Zion is first mentioned in 2 Samuel 5:7, and it says, "Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David." And it is referred to again like this, city of David with Zion, together by each other several more times. There's one in 1 Kings, there's one in 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, a few more. And I think that that's really important, the city of David and Zion. So then if we go and we look at the nature of the Davidic covenant, we see that David is promised that an eternal king will be born of his line. And this eternal king is going to need an eternal kingdom. So if we're following this line of logic and we're looking at the evidence that's being presented to us, we can come to the conclusion that David is a symbolic version of the eternal king, which is Jesus Christ, and the city of David is being used as a symbolic version of the spiritual eternal kingdom, which is Zion. So what's happening in this verse is that not only are we looking back to the past of we were delivered from Babylon, it's also already looking to the future eternal kingdom where Jesus will reign, which is Zion. And then if we look at the second part of verse 1, it's we were like those who dream. And I believe that there are a couple elements to what this phrase is trying to get at. And the first one is that there's a reality that God frequently reaches out to his people through dreams, and he gives them insight into the future. And the second element is that there was a part of this that was just so surprising and captivating, and the Israelites were so captured by it that they literally felt like they were dreaming. Like, this can't be real. We're dreaming. And I was trying to think through a time in my life where I've been somewhere or been through something where I just couldn't imagine that really being real. And I'm a big Ohio State fan, so I oftentimes can go back to sports to find those things. And so I remember in 2015 when the Buckeyes were playing the Oregon Ducks in the first college football championship. And they had beat Alabama the week before, go Big Ten, boo SEC. And now they were going up against the Oregon Ducks. They're underdogs once again, and they don't just beat them, but they win by 3 touchdowns, and they put them away. And me and my friends are sitting on my couch in my parents' living room, and we're cheering, and we're overcome by this shock and how excited we are. And it was almost like one of those moments where you have to pinch yourself to remember that it's real. And in some sense, that's what's happening here for the Israelites. They're so surprised by this reality that it was like they were dreaming. And so if we look at verse 2, it says, "Then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongue with shouts of joy." We see that the Israelites in verse 2 are responding to this reality in an even more outstanding way than they were before. First, it was like, oh man, it's like this is a dream. Now, they're being overcome by laughter and shouts of joy. So once again, just before we step into what this experience was like for them, I think it's important to attempt to define the joy that they're feeling. And so John 15:11 says, "These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy be full." And we have the joy of the Lord within us. So once we have experienced salvation and Jesus has restored us and we are washed clean, we have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit within us, in our heart. And what that brings is, it means that we can experience the very joy and love that the Father has towards the Son and that the Son has towards the Father. And we can have just a small piece of that within us, and that could be our joy. And that's what the Israelites are experiencing here. And this joy is overwhelming them. Spurgeon says of their celebration, "They were so full of joy, they literally couldn't contain themselves. The provision and mercy of the Lord was so unbelievably amazing, they could do nothing other than laugh. And then when they could finally manage to speak, they moved on to rejoicing the Lord." They were so overcome by the provision of the Lord and by the restoration that they had experienced that all they could do was laugh. And then after that laughter finally came to an end and they could finally speak once again, they went into shouting praises of joy to the Lord. Dr. Moore would kind of be I imagine. I'm not quite there yet, but we will be hopefully eventually, and you've been through it. Kind of like holding a child in your hands right after it's been born. You're sitting there and you're with your family and you're looking at the miracle of life that's before you, and you're overcome by emotion, and there's laughter and there's tears and there's joy. And then you finally move to just thanking the Lord for this incredible gift that's been given you, the gift of a child and the gift of life. And I think of a man that's living in Nepal named Bipin, who I met on a mission trip that I went on in 2017. And from the outside looking in, Bipin is obnoxious and loud and hyper, and even could seem a bit like a simpleton in some ways. But once you get to know Bipin, you get to know the joy that's in Bipin from the fact that he has had this salvation, and now his family, his child and his wife have this salvation, and now they get to participate in bringing the gospel to Nepal, which is one of the fastest growing Christian countries in the world. He is overwhelmed by that joy. And one of the things that Bipin does, that it's kind of a goofy thing, is he looks at the Lord and the fire that the Lord has given him, and he actually shouts often, like, "Fire!" And like he's jumping around and he's running to people. And the very first time he met us, he would come up and he would shake our hand and he'd say, "I'm Bipin Sharman." And he would say, "The fire of the Lord is here." And Bipin is overcome by that joy. And he's a fool for the Lord. He is not afraid of what people might look at him because he's so overcome by that joy. And that is what these Israelites are feeling here. This sort of rejoicing is not actually new to the Israelites. If we look back at Psalm 105:43, it says, "So he brought his people out with joy, his chosen ones singing." And so what this chapter is talking about is the fact that this restoration and this deliverance isn't even the first time that Israel has gone through restoration and deliverance. They were delivered from Egypt, and then they were restored, and now they're being delivered and restored again from Babylon. And they sang praises to the Lord just the same way that the Israelites in this psalm are shouting joy. They're rejoicing the Lord because of what has been gifted to them. In the second part of verse 2, we see, "And they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them." I think that's important to consider Psalm 79. In verse 10, it is talking about there's a nation of Gentiles, there's a nation of unbelievers that is looking upon Israel, a devastated and destroyed Israel. And this nation of Gentiles goes, "Where is your God?" And they're mocking them. It's like they're coming down. They're on a pedestal and they're looking down at Israel. If your God was real and he was good, how could you be sitting in this rubble? Where is he now? Where is your God? And what we see in this verse happening, "Then they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them." That same nation, those same Gentiles, those same unbelievers are now standing, and they're in awe of the glory of what has just happened. They are in an opposite spot where they were. Where is your God? And now they are, your God has done great things. Your God is great. Dr. Estes, in his Christian Standard Bible Commentary on Psalm, says, "The ultimate result of the restoration of Israel was not the prominence of Israel, but the glory of the Lord. The Lord's blessing prompted joy in his people. Joy overflowed then into praise, laughter, and then shouts of joy. And the praise directed the nations to appreciate the glory of the Lord." They were so overcome. They were burdened by laughter, and then it turned into shouts of joy, and those shouts of joy then spread to nations that were unbelievers to look upon and see the glory of the Lord that he had delivered them. In verse 3, it says, "The Lord has done great things for us, and we are glad." When we move into this verse, we see repetition and realization. We see that it is repeating the fact that the Lord has done great things for them, and now it's the Lord has done great things for us. And then they're reflecting once again back on verse 2 when they see they were overcome by joy, and then they were moved into shouts of joy and rejoicing, and they're glad for that. But there's distance. So if we look at verse 4, we start to see that distance come about. "Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like the streams in the Negeb." We're seeing repetition being used once again. In verse 1, it's restored, "When the Lord restored our fortunes of Zion," and now it is, "Restore our fortunes, O Lord." It's presenting us with a parallel of a separate but similar restoration event. We have been restored and delivered from Babylon, and now we need restoration again, Lord. The memory of the past restoration has driven them to want future restoration. And so Jerusalem, at this moment, is being rebuilt, and the rebuilding has come to a standstill. And so the people of Israel are discouraged, and they're desperate to feel the Lord's joy once again, and bask in that restoration once again. And one of the ways to describe this is by using a metaphor that we see like the streams in the Negeb. So the Negeb is in southern Israel, and it is in a dry and barren place. And for most of the year, the Negeb is cracked and dusty, and there's no signs of life. But then when the rainy season comes, the Negeb is revitalized, and there's rushing water, and there's life sprouting up once again. So this is exactly what the Israelites are seeking. They feel dry, and they feel cracked, and they don't feel the presence of the Lord like they have before, and they're desperate to be revitalized and to have their joy be so overwhelming once again that they have to shout in joy and rejoice the Lord, and their joy is flowing from them like the waters of the Negeb are flowing. They're praying for this future restoration, and in verses 5 and 6 show us a bit of what this future restoration, what are we going to have to do to get there? What is the in-between of, now we're praying, this is what happens, and then restoration comes upon us. So verse 5, it says, "Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy." And verse 5 is giving us the second of 3 mentions of joy, which then would lead us to know that it's now impossible to read Psalm 126 and not be aware of a central theme that is becoming very obvious. So it's restored and then joy, restore and then joy. So Israel was restored and delivered from Egypt, and then there was joy. And then they were restored and delivered from Babylon, and then there was joy once again. And they're praying for future restoration. And then that means that there has to be future joy that comes into play. We're looking at what happens before that restoration comes. And so, "Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy." And so what does it look like to sow in tears, to sow our tears? And basically, it's just like a plant. Though in the present we must sow our tears and we must sow our hardship, the seed will grow and we will reap what comes from it. They will reap the joy of the Lord because he has restored them once again. In verse 6, it says, "He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him." It is repeating and reinforcing what we just saw in verse 5. "Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy." Verse 6, "He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy. It's important to recognize that the sowing period, it will not be easy and it will be full of hardship, but we need to be faithful, because what comes after that is the restoration and joy of the Lord. You will be restored, and through this you will shout joy to the Lord, rejoicing in the Lord. So when we read Psalm 126, I think that, as we talked in class, it would be irresponsible not to also visit Psalm 127, because I think that it's speaking back on some of the same things. So Psalm 127 is different from Psalm 126, because Psalm 126 is a psalm of lament, and Psalm 127 is a psalm of wisdom. And the main theme of Psalm 127 is that the Lord will give us provision and he will give us protection. So verse 1 says of Psalm 127, "Unless the Lord builds the house, he who will build it in labor, those who build it labor in vain." Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. What we go to build only matters if God is invited into the process. The Lord is essential in all human missions and all human endeavors, and it's from just building a house to moments of hardship to anything we can imagine. The Lord has to be invited in on those things. And if the most basic tasks can't be completed without the Lord, like building a house, it's complicated in our minds, but compared to some of the things that we will have to go through and suffer through, building a house is such a simple task. So if they can't be completed, then how can the most complicated task be completed if the Lord is not there? How can it be done without vain if the Lord isn't there? And so if we look at verse 2, then right after, this verse is awesome because I think that we see some human thought go into it. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. I think there's practical thought that's going on here of we have a long week. We have a lot of homework due. We have projects. I have to be here preaching this to you. Adam preaches on Friday. He's setting that up. So what we do is we add hours to the beginning of our day, then we add hours at the end of our day. We extend our day, and you know what, I'm going to go to the library today and I'm going to spend 14 hours there. So I'm going to pack my lunch, I'm going to bring my coffee, I'm going to bring my water, I'm going to find a corner in the back, and I'm going to slave away at my work. I'm going to go as hard as I can. And what it's saying is you can add as many hours to your day as you want. And you can work as hard as you want. And you can eat as quickly as you want. But none of these things are going to be worth it if the Lord is not involved directly. They will be in vain. There will be no good that comes from them. Verses 3 through 5 are a response to verses 1 through 2. They say, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate." So a lot of people can read this psalm and they can take away from it that they're supposed to have as many children as they possibly can so that they can fill their quiver. And I don't think that is what it is trying to teach us. Children are a gift, and they're a gift given to a family, and it lasts so much longer than the hard work that was put in, and they're an eternal gift to the Lord. And similarly to the distance that when we shoot an arrow, that it can fly, it's flying farther than we can stab a sword or throw a javelin or a spear. It goes farther than both of those things. A child extends the voice of the parents. It extends the family farther than the parents could go alone. And once the child is mature and ready to be sent out into the world, it can be put into the parent's quiver. What it's saying is that parents have a responsibility to give the gospel to their children and pray constantly that these children will come to salvation in the Lord. And then once they're prepared for that, they can be put into the parent's quiver. You wouldn't take an arrow that is unprepared for battle into battle. If you had a stick that didn't have an arrowhead or didn't have feathers, you wouldn't put it in your quiver. Because if you went to pull it out and couldn't shoot it, then it would be worthless. And it's saying somewhat the same thing of these children. I mean, we're never going to say that human life is worthless, but once they're mature enough, they're ready to be sent out. And the enemies that will oppose the Father will be overwhelmed by the power of the Lord in the children. And if we have faith in the Lord's provision for the future, then we will certainly be restored. Psalm 126 looks back at past restoration and then looks forward to future restoration. It sees that there are going to be hardships and struggles on the way to that restoration. Psalm 127 says that during those hardships, during those sufferings, waiting for the restoration, we must bring the Lord into that. And we can be protected and provided for by the Lord in those moments. And then our children, when they're mature and put into the quiver, will reap the joy of the restoration that will come. And they will be able to rejoice to the Lord, for they have felt that restoration. What we're seeing here, brothers, is a clear connection to the restorative nature of Jesus and what Jesus came to earth to do. In Psalm 126 is vividly alluding to what is to come. The death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus Christ is our restoration. For the people of Psalm 26, it was to come, and for us it has come. We've been restored. If this is what we believe, then we know exactly what we should be doing next. We should be shouting for joy, and we should be recognizing what the Lord has done for us. And if we are attempting to truly grasp what he has done, we would be absolutely overcome by the sacrifice and the commitment that Jesus made to us. And not only would it force us into laughter and force us into overwhelming joy, it would force us to spread that glory of God to the nations of unbelievers and Gentiles. We would be so overwhelmed by it that we have to shout of it. The Lord has done great things for us. The Lord has done great things for you, and he's done great things for me. And it is imperative for us to look at Psalm 126 and Psalm 127 and to know that the road ahead is not simple, and the road ahead will require us to sow in our own tears, and it will require us to work through hardships, and it's going to require faith from us. And that faith, however, will lead us to the provision of the Lord. He will always provide. The Lord will come beside us as he's already restored us, and he will restore us again. The Lord is faithful. And he sent his one and only Son to die on a cross to take our sins and the weight of our endless burdens. And now we're here together, sitting in this room. We're exegeting and basking in the glory of his text, all because of this restoration. We have gone through the restoration that the Lord provides us at the moment of our salvation. We are restored. We're rejoicing and we're singing our praises, and if we're not, then we should be convicted to do so. We should not be able to hear of the death, burial, and resurrection, to hear of the sacrifices that he's made, to hear of the fact that he has restored us, and be able to be silent, and to be able to be, okay, we're glad. We should be overwhelmed by this joy. There are going to be moments and seasons of hardship and suffering that are going to come before us. And they're going to be long and they're going to be frequent. that does not erase what the Lord has done and what the Lord will do again. We know that we are part of a victorious team, that Jesus will come back and he will reign. And we are a part of that team. And there's joy in that, to look to the future and know that beside Jesus, we are victorious as well. We as people of God should be full of joy for the restoration that the Lord has provided us and for the restoration that the Lord will provide us once again. Let's go ahead and pray. Lord, I just pray that you allow us to be, as followers of you, overcome by the joy that your restoration brings. And I pray that you don't allow us to be silent, that you allow it to overcome us with laughter, and then that laughter turns into shouts of joy, and then that those shouts of joy will turn into us bringing the glory of what you've done to the nations so that they can look back and reflect on just how good you are. I pray that you allow this to weigh on us, and that we find more joy in what you've done for us, and that you allow us to be a part of that joy and to dwell on that joy. In your name we pray. Amen.